You know what's troubling to me as a writer of African American fantasy fiction is seeing the psychological effects of white supremacy on the African American mind. When I'm usually presenting characters, a lot of people will look at this and say, it's not ISIS. They'll look at this character design and say, it's not ISIS. But these same people, these same Negroes, will say, this is Thor. They will say, this is a Superman. And it's very disturbing and very perplexing to me as a writer of African American fantasy fiction, seeing these psychological effects on the African American mind. A video I watched a while back called "A Cognitive Distortion." I did a little bit of research on cognitive distortion. That is where, in the person's mind, they see things, in a distorted way, and they think that this distortion is reality. And when I look at the African American mind and the African American imagination, it's very, very troubling to see that, African Americans can't imagine themselves as fantasy characters or or in fantasy situations, and that the lens of their imagination is colored by the narrative of white supremacy and, more importantly, the white liberal. And this is very disturbing to me. As a guy who writes fantasy fiction for a reason. I write it so that people can open up their minds and open up their imaginations and see things, from in a different way. And seeing the severe effects of this cognitive distortion on, the mind of the African American shows us how far we have to go, because if we don't see ourselves in situations, then we won't have, the vision or the imagination to see what could be, and we'll always see what is. And that's why I think for there hasn't been much growth in African American communities, and that's one of the big problems, and that keeps us from expanding and building on our own neighborhoods, is the fact that we can't imagine them being anything but what is. We can't imagine what could be because our minds are stuck in this cognitive distortion, that everything has to fit within a white standard or meet some sort of white standard in order to be black. Again, it's like the black identity is still being shaped and molded by white supremacy. And I see this, when I present stuff like ISIS to people. A couple months ago, even at my own dinner table, when I presented the cover for, ISIS, Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, I was told these aren't black people. Um, and on the cover, I was told again they weren't black people on the cover, and it really upset me until I watched this Iceman video where he pretty much explained to me explained to us all what cognitive distortion is. And the problem with people who believe in cognitive distortion, they have it's psychological damage. Um, that you believe that anything black is not black unless it's validated by a white person, and I even go further than what he did about cognitive distortion because I've seen this. You believe that it's not black unless a white person says it's black. So you're not even defining your own identity and your own culture, and that's very disturbing. I mean, because that means, again, African Americans, for the most part, are still living in a box, even after slavery, Jim Crow, the civil rights period. Many African Americans are still living in a box and defining themselves through the lens of white supremacy. And that's disturbing because, you cannot grow as long as you live life on somebody else's terms and you define yourself by somebody else's terms. And, because they're always going to keep making the rules for you and you're not making them for yourself. And this is, again, one of the reasons why I think, black community has not grown in 40 years, because a lot of people are still mentally in a ghetto and they can't imagine, what their communities can be. And this is why, a lot of people talk about, redlining, racism, Reagan. I really don't think that has anything to do with it, because a lot of people, they were making good money. A lot of people 40 years ago, 30 years ago, they had these very good jobs, city jobs, government jobs, and they could have, taken their community if they had an imagination and a vision, and, rolled up the sleeves and really built that into a great community, just like the Hispanics did. I live in the South Bronx, and, the Hispanics took the very same neighborhoods, and turned them into something because they had imagination and vision. I'm seeing, Africans doing the same thing. Africans who have the same skin color as black people, same thing, have this imagination and creativity, and they're building businesses and doing things. But when I look at black people, there is no imagination there. Whatever the liberal tells them is black, whatever white supremacy tells them is black, they believe to be black. And we have to come out of that. And I don't know if I'm ahead of the game or something like that, but I try to define my own standard for blackness and the stories I write, and in Africa, especially in African American fantasy fiction like the ISIS series, I try to define what this should be. Because every other culture in the world defines what their culture is, and they define it and they establish it as what it is. Because again, the black identity is over the last 40 years is mostly been, it's, I even say go even further back as far, I can go back as far as after the Emancipation Proclamation. Not even there. I'm not going to go there. I'm going to go, I'm going to say the last 40 years. I'm just going to go say the last 40 years. The African American identity, it's been lost and muddled. Because I will say that, just take that, I'll just say this, that the African American identity was pretty clear, you know, before the post civil rights period. It was very clear of what an African American was, what a black person was, you know, and we had our own culture, we had our own identity. And now we have enough people are not trying to define what black is for themselves. Black people are trying to, again, this integration thing. What happened is a lot of people are trying to integrate and assimilate, and it's really affecting the African American identity to the point where we're saying that something isn't black unless it fits into this narrative of this white liberals and these white supremacists. Everything has to be one way. And I grew up in junior high school seeing this personally. Unless you fit into this mold of this, stereotyped Nike guy who bought Nike sneakers, used slang, um, wore all this street stuff, you weren't considered a black person. Um, you had to fit that mold, and I didn't want to be a part of that mold. And to me, that's a very limited scope of what a black person is. Um, you know, as a writer, I find that to be very limiting. And that's what's very limiting about trying to write African American fiction, because everything just fits in a tiny little box, and you only can write. The reader only wants to read, three, four different type of stories, and that's not a challenge for a writer to produce. That kind of concept, it gets boring over time. You're writing the same stories over time. But what's disturbing is, many African Americans will sit there and read the same story 4 and 5 times, like I saw in the 1990s during the book craze. There were about 35, 40 books about single, successful, well-educated black women who couldn't find a man. I found that to be very boring to write. And we never got a counterpoint from black men or black authors talking about what the men had to deal with. And we didn't even hear from the black men, you know, until until YouTube came along. And then even then, you had people trying to silence black men for trying to speak out and finally give people that counterpoint. Um, but I find when I run into this cognitive distortion, it really it's really frustrating, because I run into this from people who I thought would know better, college educated people, people with master's degrees, bachelor's degrees, PhDs, people who I thought were very smart, and I could present them with a story, and they would just pick up right on it, like points in the story. Like a lot of people they get confused talking about why is Isis the daughter of Osiris, and I sit there and I explain it to them, you know, that I'm trying to that I'm trying to do something with the mythology so I can fuse it with African American history, and I mean, some people go like it's not the original ISIS, or it's like, but I'm like, it's a fantasy story. Again, I don't have it over here. Let me go look for it. They'll tell me again. These same people, if I put this up in front of them, they would tell me this is Thor, and those same people, they would tell me this is Superman, and these same people will tell me that their kids are watching Monster High, and they'll tell me that you know Dracula can have a daughter named Draculaura, or you know the Wolfman can have a daughter named Claudine Wolf, and and that you know vampires can were date werewolves because Draculaura dates Claudine Wolf's brother, Claude Wolf, and all this will make sense to them. But Osiris having a daughter makes no sense to them, even though it boggles my mind. I present these concepts to people, featuring black characters, and all of a sudden, it's not true. But a big company like Mattel can present you with a concept again: daughter of Dracula, um, daughter of the Wolfman, daughter of the Abominable Snowman, daughter of Sasquatch, daughter of Cleo Denial, who's the daughter of the Mummy, and mummies are dead, and they have parts taken out of them, but they can have children. But I present them with the concept, daughter of Osiris, and all of a sudden the cognitive distortion kicks in, and they can't believe it, but they can believe these other concepts because a white person came up with them, and it's a white corporation behind them, so they automatically believe it. And to me, that clearly shows me the direct impact of cognitive distortion. I have a family member who's in education. They see the effects of cognitive distortion at an early age because, um, you know, kids can mentally conditioned at an early age to run to seek the approval. They'll behave for a white teacher, but they'll act out with a black teacher, and it's disturbing because you see the cognitive distortion in there at an early age. That I have to be at my best behavior for this white teacher, this white female teacher, but I don't value the black teacher to behave in her presence. And that to me is very, very disturbing. And and I've seen also this that they'll say things like, "I don't like brown people." These are the things that are said in the classroom at the age of 6 and 7, and this is how deeply ingrained cognitive distortion is in and in the black community, and with white supremacy, the effects on the mind. And it is most troubling to me because I'm I thought black people want when I was reading Milestone comics back in the '90s in college. I thought we had moved forward. I thought kids wanted to see black characters, and they would relate to black characters. But I think what it is, because Milestone again, that was a company approved by white liberals and Warner Brothers, and I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people bought those comics and related to it. But what I find is that if you're a black man and you present ideas and concepts to black people about themselves, images of themselves, again the cognitive distortion kicks in, and they don't want to believe that it is possible for a black man to present them an image of themselves, and and that image is just as valid as the image presented to them by the white liberal. And this is something that this shows how much further we have to go as a people, because psychologically, I look at you know as a writer, I look at how black people view themselves, and that has a direct impact on how we view ourselves, as how we present ourselves to the world, and how we build our communities. We don't really see, how these things correlate with each other. We just see, ourselves as so-called as black people, but we don't, define what that is. We're letting other people define, what being black is, and that is holding us back as a people. I mean, a lot of people, I mean, I just, again, I find it very disturbing that I can present you a picture of Isis, an Egyptian goddess who comes from, a black country. Because if Nubia and Egypt are sister nations, as I have read doing my research, I have read that Egypt and Nubia were sister nations, and the Nubians were black, and the Egyptians were black. How can, you not believe that a black goddess actually exists? But you can believe, a white woman on television, actress Joanna Cameron, is Isis, even though she's just a woman who finds an amulet in the sands of the desert. She gets and she calls on the power of Isis, but you'll believe this white woman is Isis, but you won't believe something that I designed straight from the mythology of the Osirian legend. Comes straight from the Osirian legend, has direct relation to the Osirian legend, directly comes from the mythology. They'll say, some black people will say, that's not Isis. And again, that's very, very, very troubling to me. I mean, again, it shows you the difference between, images in black and white, and again, the reflection and correlation of what we don't understand. I mean, I've run into this before with another book. Let me go get it. The book was called The Cassandra Cookbook. It was a romantic comedy, and people thought this was a regular cookbook, and they would never see it. They would just they would never take a look and say, the word novel here at the bottom. It says novel, clearly says a novel, but they would not see it. They would sit there and go, is that a cookbook? And it showed me, the effects of, critical thinking, again, and the cognitive distortion. They didn't want to see it as a novel. They couldn't, see the title. I was forced to change the title because so many people just could not, see a play on words and could not see the word Cassandra Cookbook. Because I did this, again, thinking that people, understood what chick lit, because the chick lit books use these type of titles. Back in the mid 2000s, they were using these type of titles all the time. And, I tried to do this with the African American in mind, trying to give them the exact same, type of reading experience that a lot of these chick lit authors give white readers. And again, they could not decipher Cassandra Cookbook and see, it's a recipe for success, and that's basically what the story was supposed to be about. But they couldn't, figure that out, and I was forced, to dumb the title down and call it a recipe for success on the ebook because I would go to book fairs and they wouldn't get it, and what I just find it very sad. I present concepts to black people and that they go over some black people's heads. And, you know, because I think about it, if we have all of these college educated people, you should be able to present a concept to someone and they should be able to understand it. But what I find in a lot of cases, I mean, I know people with Ivy League degrees who could not figure out, that Isis was a daughter of Osiris, or that the Cassandra Cookbook, the title meant, a recipe for success. But these same people, again, would go out and buy a Monster High doll and not think twice about it. These same people, they would go out and buy a white chick lit book, or, go see a movie based on a chick lit book with a white actress in it and figure out what that title meant within 5 seconds. And it shows me the psychological effects of white supremacy on the human mind, and that people will believe what they want to believe, and they'll believe what fits into the box of white supremacy based on regarding the black identity. And our identity really needs to be, defined by us and our terms. And when I look at American media these days, we're not defining it the way we should be defining it. I look at American media and the African American image is being defined by, these hucksters like your Lee Daniels or your Tyler Perry or your Oprah Winfrey, and they're presenting black people with repackaged old stereotypes of, your mammies, your coons, your sapphires, your brutes, um, and your Uncle Toms in a brand new box and breathing new life into these old stereotypes and making them the norm. And it's very troubling for me and it's very frustrating for me because I have been at this since about 1994 trying to, create a new image of black people, and create an image that really reflects who we really are. Um, and show that there's different experiences within the black experience, and then there's not just one black experience, the one that the white liberals in Hollywood and Madison Avenue want you to believe is black. What I want to present, are these different stories and these different experiences because we really, as black people in the 21st century, we really need to get out of the box. And because the box is confining, it's very, very limiting, and you can't really get creative in the box. You can't really show, all of these different pictures. And on top of it, as a writer, I really look at it as, keeping us competitive because I look at these TV shows on the CW, all these fantasy shows, your Arrows, your Vampire Diaries, your Reigns, and all these other shows. These shows have big followings, they're big hits, and we're still making Empire, which is a ripoff, really of Platinum, which came on the underpaid Negroes network UPN. And we're still making shows that we should have moved past, 20, 25, 20. I'm not even 25 years ago, but no, it is 20 years ago because we should have moved past this and, moved into more competitive stuff. I mean, everybody's making a bunch of money on this fantasy market. There's a new generation of kids coming up, hundreds of millions of dollars waiting to be made, and you have black people still making the same type of TV shows, the same type of movies, the same type of books, because, again, the imagination is limited by white supremacy, and they still see themselves through the lens of white supremacy. And, that's not freedom in my eyes. The way I see freedom is you having the freedom to define yourself and define what your culture is and define what it's about, not being told and dictated to you what black is. And that's what really troubles me, when I present concepts to them and they tell me that's not a black person, that's not black culture. When I did the research on it in writing stories, like the ISIS series, Temptation of John Haynes, Thetas, and Recipe for Success, and I studied black culture and black history to put in these stories, and people tell me that it's not black based on an image that they see on a book cover or things that they even read in the story. They tell me it's not black, and I can go back, in a historical context, and prove all of these concepts out because I've done the research. Before I write a single word of a story, I do the research on culture and history and things like that, and I have a good understanding of Black history, but it's very limited. People they only take their history and their stories, from the white liberals. As I keep going back to David Carroll, but he said one thing that was very true. Black people only want to see like two sets of pictures. They want to see slavery and they want to see the civil rights movement. The only two periods they want to see, because in those two periods, you get to see black people being a victim of racism and white supremacy. But there are other stories we can tell, about the black experience. And we need to see those stories, and those stories need to be told. But because everybody wants to fit within this narrative of this white liberal, we did have a short period during the 1980s where in the early to mid 1990s, where you had your Cosby shows, your Different Worlds, Fresh Prince, Sister Sister, Smart Guy, all these other shows that were giving us this picture, and even the Static Shock cartoon where we were getting that picture, of black life. But then all of a sudden, abruptly, it ends, and then we go back to, 15 years of minstrels, and it's very, very, very disturbing, and for me, to see that we're not continuing to pick up that nobody's picking up the baton and trying to, redefine what black means, what the black identity means, and, you know, that everybody's still got that there's so many people still, even with college degrees and, advanced educations, they still have cognitive distortion, and they still see their blackness through a white lens, and that that's not going to help us grow as a people. That's not going to help us advance, as a race. That's just going to hold us back and set us back. You know, it's going to set us back. And as I've seen, we've gone all the way back, to the 1930s in terms of image. And this is one of the things I talked about in another video about why it's important to control your image, because how you present your image to the world is what image you put out there is what the world is going to see of you. This is your reflection of the world, and if you can't control your image, others will control it, and you'll be seeing yourself through their lens and not your lens. And seeing yourself through your own lens is very important, because then you control your image, you control how you're seen, and you control how others see you. And that's one of the things I try to do when I'm writing stories and when I'm publishing books, is I'm trying to help people understand this, how you're seen is important. And this is why it's important for black people to control their own image and control the content that is related to them, and that the right people are controlling it. Because, people like Lee Daniels and Tyler Perry, they're, as I see it, hustlers out to make a fast dollar on the black community. They're not about, you know, elevating the African American image and making it the best it can be. They're about maintaining the white supremacist cognitive distortion that, black people are inferior, and that anything in their image is inferior, and that anything that we present has to be, if there has to be something wrong with it because it comes from a black person, and that things that come from a white person, or a non-black person that are reflective of black people, those must be the truth, and the image made by the black person must be a lie. This is what cognitive distortion truly is. And, because cognitive dissonance, that was another, I had got them mixed up at one time. Cognitive dissonance is when you say one thing and you do another, but cognitive distortion is when you see the picture of, and you start thinking that the white man's ice is colder. And you only see, white people, anything that they produce as superior, and anything that you produce yourself as a black person, you start automatically seeing it as inferior, or there's something being wrong with it, or there must be some sort of flaw in it. That's cognitive distortion. Or when you see, a black person in an authority figure, you see them, you don't acknowledge their authority, you don't give them the respect of their title, but you'll give the white person the respect of their title. That's cognitive distortion in action. Just like my family member who works in the public school system, none of the kids really want to give her authority, especially in the face of a white person. And I had to sit down and talk to her and tell her, look, that's cognitive distortion in action. When these kids don't want to listen, but they'll listen and submit to this white person, this white female teacher, but they won't listen to this black female teacher. That's cognitive distortion, and I've seen it quite a bit, at book fairs and when I'm doing book promotion, because, again, I'll present them with a black image of ISIS. They'll tell me that image is not true, but these same people, again, and they'll tell me also that Osiris can't have a daughter, or these other things, but these same people, again, I'll point to the Thor action figure automatically. That's Thor. I'll I can put up a picture of Kevin Sorbo as Hercules. That's Hercules. I can pick up a picture of Christopher Reeve, and that's a Superman. But I can put up a picture of a black woman as Isis. That's not Isis. I can, tell them that things like when I write stories that, I hear Samuel L. Jackson as Osiris or Angela Bassett as the Queen Isis. No, it can't be true. But, it's something that most black people, they don't understand what cognitive distortion is. And I wanted to do the video so that people could understand, what cognitive distortion is and how it affects the African American imagination. Because, again, your imagination is very powerful, and if you can't imagine yourself being something, then you can't make it reality. If you can't imagine, you know, what could be, you'll never be able to turn it into reality. Um, because your imagination and the African American imagination, as I've seen, you know, is very limited. Because I don't see. That's why I say it's important for us to have, young adult fiction like, these ISIS series books, because you need to see things that open up your mind and open up your imagination so that you can see the world as black, and you can see black people doing things, and black people going out into the world, and you can see yourself in the world, and you can see yourself as a part of the world, and you can see yourself making contribution to your world and to your community. You can see the value of being part of an African American community, because it's very important for you to see, you know, where you are in the world and what you can be in the world. Um, because that's the way I see things. I don't want to see, a generation of kids growing up seeing themselves, as the background character in some, ensemble, like a Monster High, like a token Claudine Wolf, or in the Ghostbusters, Winston Zedmore. He's just a black guy. I want them to see a person who is black making a contribution as a leader in their own right, and defining themselves as their own character, as ISIS does, as East Team does, and as John Haynes does in my stories. This is what I want to see, because it really shows how much your thinking has changed. Because when you see just a black character, he's just a token in the back, or he's just the black guy. Versus a black character, who is on the same story footing. They're the main character in the story. The plot revolves around them. The action revolves around them. It's about them solving the problem in the story. That's very important for a black child, to see, because then they start seeing themselves, in that light and in that perspective. And when you then fuse science fiction and fantasy elements in there, then you start seeing yourself in careers like in Cyber Goddess. I put a lot of STEM stuff in there, like science and technology. You start seeing yourself in these fields, and then you start seeing, I want to do that. Especially if you're like a young child, you start saying, I want to do that. That looks interesting. I want to be a part of that field, and you start seeing yourself, and you start seeing the world differently. Versus, token black character. There's no real story behind them. They're just, background fodder, so that the white character can, go out and solve the problems, solve the mission, and they go out and do all the work while he just sits in the back, and that's not really good for black children, as I see it. Again, I don't like having, black characters. I like having characters that are black, that do things, and the story revolves around them. That, to me, that shows true diversity, and that shows stuff that's truly unique. Um, I know this video is going long, but this is a topic that means a lot to me, because it is part of my core mission as a publisher, to give people these positive stories about the African American experience and expand the perspective of the African American experience, because we have to start seeing ourselves outside of the lens of white supremacy and the white liberals who control Madison Avenue in Hollywood, and we have to start, defining ourselves and our culture for the 21st century. And I'm not seeing that being done. I'm seeing a lot of regression, especially when I see shows like Empire and Scandal and Blackish. I'm seeing this regression instead of a progression. Building on the legacy of, people like Bill Cosby and Quincy Jones and all of these other people, and people like Dwayne McDuffie, the late Dwayne McDuffie. And we really need to start building on that legacy, and, giving people those new images so that they can start really taking a long, hard look at themselves as black people and saying, this is the direction we want to take the black community in. And we really need to deal with this issue of cognitive distortion, and, because it's a socially engineered concept over a period of time, and we really need to start really taking it on and saying, you know what, we're going to start defining what black is and defining, what black means, and not let other cultures tell us what black means. Um, and it has to, and we really, really need to start right now. It's something I believe that needs to be done, and that's one of the reasons why I publish, books like the ISIS series, and I publish, other stories, Temptation of John Haynes, Recipe for Success, All About Maryland, the All About Nikki E books. I publish all of these because I want to see, us start taking a look at ourselves as black people, and us defining what black is, and not letting the rest of the world, define what black is and what it can become. Um, Again, you can buy, ISIS series books like ISIS: Wrath of the Cyber Goddess at on in paperback and Kindle on Amazon.com. You can buy the rest of my catalog of titles on Amazon.com. You just click the link in the description box. There's a whole list of titles there: fiction, nonfiction, young adult fiction. A lot of great books there, a lot of great reading, and I hope you enjoy them. And I hope this gets you to really start taking a look at yourself, and taking a look at the culture around you, because we have the power to define it, and we also have the power to change it. And I'm urging people, go out and try to make efforts to change how we see ourselves, because that's how the rest of the world sees us.